All right, everyone, it's time to talk about Schrodinger's Brexit. Does it exist? Does it not exist? We're not exactly sure at the moment. Boris Johnson swears up and down Brexit will get done. He's like, we will have a Brexit. And it comes out, we will Brexit by January 2020. It is assured. We will not back down. But the thing is, he told everyone before he wouldn't back down on the initial, we will have Brexit. I will not extend Brexit. And at the last minute, he for plausible deniability, he doesn't sign the letter that Parliament forces him to send off to Brussels, so requesting a Brexit extension, then sends another letter that he does sign saying, well, I don't agree with this personally. And it's like, okay, that's ballsy, but it's ultimately symbolic and meaningless. Here's the thing. It looks now, in polling, like the Tories may win an outright majority. That is that I guess support for a decent Brexit is high enough that they may hand Boris Johnson his majority without him even needing to consult Nigel Farage. I think that's a terrible thing. I think it'd be wonderful if the number of Brexiteer Tories and Nigel Farage's Brexit Party members is more than half of the parliament there, because then you can get a Brexit going. The problem is that if Boris Johnson doesn't have to parlay with Nigel Farage, we don't know whether he's going to go hardline Brexiteer and actually deliver a true clean break from the EU, or just kick the can down the road a little further and say, oh, well, now I've got time, I can make a better deal. Now I've got time, I've got the mandate, so let me talk to the EU again. And the problem is, of course, because of the strangulation of government, there's always a risk that therefore Brexit never happens again. And eventually, I hate to say this, the hardline Brexiters will hate this when I say this. At some point, the argument of needing a second referendum actually becomes valid. It's not right now. The idea that because it's been a few years, oh, we need to have another people's vote, well, you already had one. People voted for Brexit. They voted to leave the EU. If, though, it drags on year after year after year, when you get to the point where you're in a totally different decade, the argument becomes a little bit more plausible. Hey, a lot of the people that voted for it, or against it for that matter, are dead. There's a whole new generation of people now coming to vote. Why shouldn't they have a say? We haven't left officially yet. We'll have another people's referendum. And I have no doubt, by the way, that they would Brexit anyway, that people would vote for it. In fact, I think that the people that were on the fence would break for Brexit heavily, and you'd probably see Brexit winning by a larger margin. That being said, it would still cause political chaos, and it's undue. It's not necessary. It would cause economic damage. Under the best scenario you have now, Boris Johnson actually sticks to his word, gets his majority, tears up the parliamentary agreements preventing him from having a hard Brexit, and says bye to the EU. That's the best scenario, and that'd be wonderful. That's exactly what he and others have campaigned on. The problem is I don't think that's likely. I think that he's likely to stick around and say, oh, well, now that I've got the votes, I'm going to sign off whatever deal comes next, and we'll have our Brexit in an expedited manner. That would be a disaster. It's been pointed out by Pat Condell and others that the current Brexit agreement that's been loosely hammered out to be agreed upon isn't really Brexit at all. The UK will remain a vassal of the EU for most purposes for a number of years thereafter. You simply won't have a vote on their policy, which means that they can abuse you every which way but loose. How are you going to stop them? You don't even have a vote at that point. You are so much better off, economic damage potentially aside, having a hard Brexit with no agreement, saying we are leaving the EU, we are not subject to any of your rules, and then negotiating thereafter as a free agent, with the backing of the US and other countries. Trump is very likely to win re-election. He's already signaled to the Tories and to Nigel Farage and people within the UK that want sovereignty, the US will be your best friend, we will protect you. Here's the world's biggest economy saying, don't play around with the losers in the EU that want to abuse you. They're openly stating that they want to abuse you. Read the agreement. They want to fuck you in the ass. Why would you want to make an agreement with them when you could hammer things out with us and with some of these Commonwealth states more quickly, stabilize the situation, and then go in and talk to the EU? Other people have trade agreements with the European Union. The United States does. Is the UK such an insignificant economy that it can't do that? What are you, the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, with nuclear weapons and one of the top naval capabilities? I think you can probably hold your own in a trade agreement with Angela Merkel and that goofball Juncker that sometimes he gets the DTs, can barely even stand. The UK leading the way will show a way forward for other countries as well to rid themselves of the tyranny of the Eurozone. And they will. Oh, I have no doubt that if the UK manages to have a clean break and negotiate things and does fairly well, I have no doubt that'll lead other parties to force a Brexit-style leaving of the EU. Of course they will. It'll start, ironically enough, in the more wealthy parts of Europe that are tired of being vampirized by other countries that have less money than them. Then it'll move on to those less fortunate nations that have become more nationalistic because they see Western Europe dissolving in a haze of multiculturalistic bullshit, and they'll leave too to self-preserve. And then Europe will go back to being peaceful and prosperous and nice. Dude, you can maintain Schengen-style free movement between the European nations with barely any additional security whatsoever and solve the problem. There's literally no reason in the entire world why you can't have all the benefits that the EU confers without the EU even existing. Like I guess the idea behind the European Union is that the literate, peace-loving, advanced, enlightened people of Europe somehow over the last half-century have become incapable of governing their own affairs without killing each other, or without devolving into a depression. But that's not true. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It ignores all recent history. It ignores the existence of NATO, among other things. What are you talking about? The thing is that the European Union wants to get big balls and play equal partner to the United States. This is about people like Merkel and Macron and all these other goofballs getting a big dick about things, having a bit of an ego trip. What the other European nations don't realize is that this is basically Germany's way of running Europe without firing a shot. You do realize how ironic it is looking from the other side of the pond, or for me in Amsterdam at the moment. It's ironic to me that you've essentially given governance of the entire continent to the same group that you bitterly fought against having the governance of back in the 1940s. Wow, by the way, taking the worst aspects of Soviet centrality and injecting it into the system. I'm sure, why does any state that was behind the Iron Curtain support this? It doesn't make any sense. I don't even know why anyone whose family comes from East Germany shouldn't support it either. By the way, last night watching a documentary on the Berlin Wall, and I was chuckling at this. Originally, I guess the Berlin Wall, you know, that defensive barrier around Berlin to keep communists from defecting, because so many of them did early on because communism is a lie. They call it the anti-fascist defensive wall or defensive rampart. Anti-fascist. It's funny because I can think of some other groups in the contemporary sense that get called anti-fascist too by the brain dead who don't understand linguistics. Come on. You need a hard Brexit. Boris Johnson, what you should do is try to get as many Brexit Party members in there as possible and deny the Tories an outright majority so they have no choice but to look upon the smiling face of Nigel Farage and ask for his permission on a few things. That way, if you do get a deal, it'll at least be tolerable. And if there is no deal, huzzah, you've actually finally gotten what you voted for, which was to leave the EU. How complex is it to just leave this union? All you got to do is say, okay, we're leaving and we're paying you this money. You don't need a deal. It's not necessary. The EU needs certain goods and services provided by the UK, otherwise it will lose millions and millions of jobs and enormous amounts of GDP, especially in some of the Eastern European states. Are you telling me that the EU's authorities are so nuts and so malevolent that they would rather punish the UK and get smacked in the face and go into a recession, therefore, than to make a deal thereafter? I think that they'd be willing to come to the table if the UK is willing to enforce its demands. That's about all. Peace out.